It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce this evening's dinner speaker, Richard Sennett. Who, along with Saskia Sassen, has been a member of the Center since September of 2010. And Richard's been a senior fellow of the Center since 2017. By way of background, which Richard doesn't need, Richard is a Centennial Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics and formerly a Professor of Humanities at NYU. He has been decorated with several awards, including the Hegel and the Spinoza Prizes. I wish I had those. His many books include The Uses of Disorder, The Hidden Injuries of Class, great title, written with Jonathan Cobb, The Culture of the New Capitalism, 2008. It's probably ready for revision. And most recently, Building and Dwelling, 2018. A very large part of Richard's academic writing is about cities and city life. Excuse my back, but the light is requires it. A large part of Richard's academic writing is about cities and city life, but I'm particularly pleased to have Richard with the Center as the work of his that I know best is about the experience of work. And I know we talk a lot about work, but we don't talk enough about work. He has a deep sense of the importance that agency has for people. And he believes, if I'm not mistaken, that the decline of agency over the past century is one of the most important reasons, perhaps the most important reason, why there has been a slow decline of life satisfaction as reported in household surveys. As I like to say, job satisfaction is 90% of life satisfaction. I made up the 90, I didn't do the regression. But I'll ask somebody to do it.
I'm not the one who should.
I'm just trying to figure out who's giving me support with the laughs. Okay. Okay. We've been lucky to have him speak at a number of our conferences over the past decade, and I truly look forward to hearing him tonight and the discussion that follows. Thank you. Richard, wherever you are, take the plan. It's hard to see this first step. It's not marked.
Ooh, these lights are terrible. Well, I'm very, very glad to be with you tonight, principally to celebrate Ned and the creation of this remarkable institution which Ned made. He writes about human flourishing, and the Center on Capitalism and Society has really flourished. So, and if I may say so, for me personally, even when we are in the depths of an argument, he's always made me think differently than I had thought before we began to speak. He's got a remarkable capacity to give a kind of life and transformational energy to other people. And Ned, I'm very grateful to you personally for that and for the work that the Center has done. I'm going to talk to you a little about an aspect of my own professional life, which isn't really academic, which is that about 35 years ago, I began consulting for the United Nations about urban issues and ways in which the city could become a more important kind of part of the discourse. The United Nations and citizens could be seen as more consequent in a way than their nation states. And this work has gradually led me, as it has led many people in the social and economic parts of the UN, to focus on climate change, and which has preoccupied me as a consultant to the UN for the last 5 years, and culminated this last week in COP26, the climate summit that's taking place in Glasgow, from which I've just come. And I do not recommend airlines that go directly between Glasgow and New York City at all. So I'm just going to talk to you, and I hope you don't mind if I talk rather informally about what COP26 has been about. And I thought I'd talk about three things. What actually were we trying to accomplish, are trying to accomplish there? Secondly, the kind of theater of climate change, which is taking place in Glasgow, and its negative effects on actually dealing with climate change issues. And third and most, I'd like to describe a discussion that Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, and a dear friend of Saskia's and mine, Rowan Williams, who's the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and I had yesterday morning, which seems an eternity, with a group of young student activists about issues of climate change. It was really quite eye-opening to me in a way, and I'll try and explain to you why. The first thing to know about COP26, what it's about, is that the agreements there are not treaties. That is, nobody is obliged to do anything by law. They are voluntary arrangements which we certify in a certain way so that they have certain kind of legal standing. But there is no way in which you can fail legally or be held to account in terms of that would bring you into the European Court of Justice, International Court of Justice, if you didn't comply with the arrangements that you'd made. And what's important about that is to emphasize that all we can do, all the United Nations can do, is advise and publicize. For instance, this runs a gamut from working with the group of 70, or the 70 poorest countries, who are also the most going to be the most impacted with climate change. Just trying to help them, as my team has done, to understand what the impacts of climate change are going to be on their cities, how to measure what they need. And that runs from that kind of activity to an activity of making transparent, I'm trying to think of good diplomatic language for it, but I'm not going to use it, to make transparent his hypocritical promises And I'll give you an example of that. As you know, the host country, prime minister, has declared war on coal, on mining coal. Yesterday, he authorized a new coal mine in Cumbria. So the only thing we can do is that we were able, thanks to some amazing people on our staff, to show what effect this authorization would have on the promise that he had made to. I don't want to diss him in particular. That I underline in particular. This is a problem. Many promisers. One departure that has happened in COP26 is that we are now going to try and determine a set of standards for non-state actors about the relationship between what they promise and what they deliver. And we need help. Non-state actors, principally corporations. And we're not economists in the main. There are economists who work in this climate area. But this is a new thing for us, that the UN would actually set standards to measure corporate delivery rather than corporate promising. So that's what the substance of COP is about. It tries to hold to account the promises made first in the Kyoto Accords and then in the Paris Summit of 2015, to hold the people who made those promises to account, to show what they've accomplished or not accomplished, and also to help the countries in need, as with this group of 70, to define more precisely what it is they need as help from the richer countries. So that's what COP26 is about, but you'd never know it, because what's actually occurred there is a kind of theatrics of climate change, a kind of theater. It's an appalling conjuncture between journalists who are on the make for headlines and politicians who live by them. And one of the forms it takes, which I want to explain to you, is this notion that, as British Prime Minister put it, that we're 1 minute before midnight, or that COP is as a now or never opportunity. And this, I have to say, gives most of the people who have been working on COP deep, deep disquiet, and I want to explain it to you why. When COP ends, if there isn't if capitalism suddenly hasn't changed course from the course we know it's on to keep using more and more to expand the terrain of emissions, if there isn't a kind of sudden transformational change, these same journalists will brand COP a failure. It didn't really accomplish anything. And our worry about this is the effect that this has on the public, which is to say, oh, they got all these famous, wealthy, powerful people together, and they couldn't make it happen. So there's nothing you can do about it. That is, that this kind of, what a friend of mine has called finalism does, is inspires a great deal of passivity and a kind of resignation in people, that you really can't do anything, because even these rich and powerful people didn't suddenly transform the world. It is sociologically an interesting problem, and I'll just explain to you why it is. A friend of mine, of the late Stanley Cohen, wrote a wonderful book called States of Denial, which is a study of principally of a kind of despair that overcame the liberal and the left in South Africa with the coming of the end of apartheid, that things didn't suddenly change. And his notion about this is that this was rooted in a prior condition where whites in the townships, whites in South Africa as a whole, knew perfectly well what was going on in the townships, but felt that they were completely, there was nothing they could do, even if they were well-meaning whites, about these conditions. It's, in other words, that if you don't have transformational change, the result is pacification and resignation. And what's interesting sociologically about this for us is that for a long time, the way we organized the rhetoric of climate action was if people only knew, they would mobilize. And in fact, the more people know about something, if it's framed in a way that something should be done but nothing is to be done, people become stop being active social actors. And the reason this states of denial thesis is important to us is really it's a kind of contrary Enlightenment idea, and it traces in a way back to the work of Horkheimer and Adorno, which is that knowledge is not empowering. The knowledge, if it's framed in this, this way of being something that requires urgent action, can actually be disempowering. And that the idea that that the framework, the rhetorical framework, if you like, is what really makes the difference between action and inaction, is something that Enlightenment thinkers, certainly like Dolbach or Diderot, weren't really aware, weren't really sensible to. But for us, what this means is that the projects of science education that we had thought were the way to mobilize public opinion are irrelevant to dealing with this other issue, this state of denial of knowing and not knowing, which has been framed rhetorically. So, as has been COP last week, that if things don't change immediately, it's an induction of pacification. So that's what worries me very much about the theater of climate change. And as I say, it's depressing with journalists who should know better. The best reporting, by the way, on COP has been from the FT. Most sober, sensible, they understand what people are doing and not doing. This whole theater of climate change is something they look at and say, well, so what? And for the week that remains of COP26, I recommend reading them. The thing I really wanted to talk to you about, finally, is this discussion which Antonio and Rowan and I had with these young activists yesterday morning. There's a kind of deep divide in these kids between hopefulness and a kind of existential despair about what the climate change means for the way they conduct their own lives. And the hopes were really pinned on Antonio Guterres, that he would somehow save this situation, hold people's feet to the fire, get them to make good on their promises, and so on. And my part of this discussion was sort of tapped into this existential despondency they feel about whether things can really be changed. Because that despondency plays into a movement now for many people who are involved in the climate issues into what's called deep adaptation. And what this deep adaptation is about is that if things go as they, on the vectors that they're currently going, that in about 10 or 15 years we're going to have really the serious prospect of societal collapse. And I'll give you an example of that we have to adapt to the fact that we're on the edge in 10 or 15 years of a deep set of societal fissures. I'll give you an example of that. My team has been looking at desertification of the Sahel, which is this huge territory in the southern Sahara. And this desertification we project will create between 25 and 30 million climate refugees over the next 2 decades. We're hoping that countries like Mali can find ways to hold them. But the reality is that at least half of them, if not about 60%, will try to leave Africa and go to Europe. It's the same problem that is occurring with desertification in Mexico, which is going to put pressures on climate refugee movement, which dwarf the kinds of movements we've seen now. And what we're trying to do is figure out how we can deal with the absolute ruptures that might occur if that in the course of that migration. You'll know that for only 1,700,000 refugees in 2015 and 16, Europe was nearly torn apart. Right-wing parties were suddenly legitimated. I think it got a lot to do with Brexit in Britain and so on. But multiply that by 10 times, and the scale of this kind of the connection between desertification in Somalia and border issues in Germany or in Austria or in Britain would be enormously magnified. So that what we are trying to do is figure out ways that societies can cope minimally, adapt to issues which could potentially tear them apart, without engaging in kind of McKinsey company kinds of, all of that kind of junk. And to, take that really seriously. And that completely connected with these kids. That seemed to be, to them, the real issue, which is how do you live in a situation of 10 or 15 years, in which catastrophe is an everyday social and political possibility. And I was horrified that it connected so much with them. I wanted them to, Antonio Guterres is very realistic, but he is a figure of hope. But in the end, they didn't believe him. And so I think what's going to happen in the intellectual, as well as I would say the social formation about climate change, assuming that things keep on the trajectory they go now, is that the whole issue of a deep adaptation comes to the fore. The notion that growth would be a solution, raising all, what is it, all boats raised together. I never understood this. I never understood economics, but somehow all the boats go up when the profits go up, so something like that. A rising tide lifts all boats. I'm afraid all the boats are leaky. So that's, it's also, we're thinking a lot about strategies of development which were premised on growth, and there's a group thinking about redistribution of existing resources rather than growth and so on. But my shop is trying to make sense of how we can think realistically about deep adaptation, and I'm hoping that we can do so in a way which counters the theater of disaster, the rhetoric that if nothing happens, if everything doesn't change, then there's nothing you can do. We want to get a more realistic look at this very, very depressing phenomenon and embrace it. So that's, I'm glad to answer any questions I can. I'm not a climatologist, so I can't answer technical questions to you. But I can answer questions about the process of COP26 and a little about where the UN is trying to head in its work on this subject. So thank you for your attention. And how do you want to do this, Ned? Do you want people to ask me questions? I can't see anyone with these lights. Anyhow, Eric, ask a question. Ask me a question. Yeah.
Yeah, we weren't sure whether.
Is there a microphone or something?
Yeah, there is. I have that now. Here, you go ahead and ask your question.
So if you could give it to Eric. You have it. Then I'll ask you.
Richard, this sort of
Yeah. It's all right. I'll do it. Don't worry.
this sort of ties together what Martin Wolf had to say and a number of other people had to say during the day. But do you know Jeff Mann's book, Climate Leviathan?
Yeah.
And that the only way out of this is, well, not the only way. One alternative way out of this, in effect, is kind of the China model, an authoritarian imposition of behavioral restrictions and constraints, and that the kind of democratic, liberal capitalism that Martin Wolf talked about at lunch cannot cope. And this, of course, is very much resonant with the discussion circa 1939-40, if you like, between Charles Lindbergh and Franklin Roosevelt about whether a messy democratic republic could possibly deal with the enormous authoritarian force of Nazism.
Right. Well, it's a wonderful question.
Thank you so much.
Just speaking practically about this, the Chinese have done anything but solve this question. It's an authoritarian regime which is involved in a deep structural contradiction between, well, in practical terms, with coal, which it wants to forbid externally and wants to develop internally. But more generally, the authoritarian infrastructure has not led to a resolution about how to deal with problems of climate change within China. I know a little about this because I have colleagues there who are trying to deal in cities like Beijing, or Wuhan with air pollution. It's a very practical urban problem. And there is no policy, or rather there are contrary policies pulled in different directions, both by different science and different factions and so on. So I have to say, I don't think that if that's our model, what you're seeing is a country with all the power in the world to do something which can't. So I don't think that the parallel to 1939 is quite, if I may say so, is quite right. Eric, what were you going to say? Can we have a? See Eric? Yeah.
Eric,
Yeah, I'm coming.
So one possibility that has often been raised as a quick fix is geoengineering. The idea, one of these ideas is that you could put enough particulates up in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight and thereby cool temperatures as much as you wanted, depending on how much particulates you put up. Was geoengineering on the agenda in Glasgow?
Sure. There are two questions about it that people raised practically. One of them is simply the amount of time a project like that would take. I mean, we have to take decisive action in the next 7 or 8 years. That's a quite long-term project. The other, which is a little closer to my own bailiwick, is that we have enough simple, straightforward technology now to deal with climate change, if only we had the political will to use that technology. In things like desertification, we know what to do. There are very simple things that don't cost very much money that could be done. And I'm all for technology, but I don't think that a scientific fix is really the way to mobilize action in short term and among very poor populations, which won't have access to that. I mean, the one technology we're really interested in, which is not being paid attention to, are cheap desalinization plants. It's not a very sexy subject, you know? And the Israelis have an enormous amount of knowledge about how to do this. It's just not being used. So I just think we have to go in another direction. I can't see a thing, so I'm relying on you, Lizzie.
have to speak up, unless we can find a mic.
No, she hasn't.
Yes, well, thank you, Sandra Navidi. Thank you for your straight talk. Much appreciated. What do you think of sustainable finance? Gartner released a study according to which supposedly 85% of financial firms last year considered ESG criteria in their investment decisions. Do you think they can make a difference the way that capital flows are directed, or is this just a green fig leaf and greenwashing?
Well, I think it's greenwashing, but you've got people in this room who will know, I'm just a simple socialist, You've got people in the room who know much more about this than I do. The one thing that was quite apparent to us, the third day we had a big session on finance, was that there were quite a lot of contortions going on about the relationship between effective and greenwashed finance. But as I say, I only have prejudice on this subject, but it might be worth some time to do a conference on this, Ned, which is, I mean, there's an incredible amount of skepticism about this. We had, I just tell you one anecdotal detail. You know that Cambridge University is now divesting itself of carbon money. And the finance officer of Cambridge came to one of our meetings, and people said, "So what are you going to invest in?" And to my untutored ear, the result was bullshit. So, you know, I think that's one of the reasons we've set up this working group that's trying to look at a little more practically and a little harder what it means for a non-state actor to actually effectively cut their carbon emissions, not use them more efficiently, which is often what is described, but actually use less. And we want to make measures of that. But as I said, I'm not really competent to answer your question beyond my firm prejudice that socialism must be somehow the answer.
Hi, Richard. Thank you again for your always acute and trenchant observations. Quick question, because you mentioned Horkheimer and Adorno and the dialectic of the Enlightenment, of course. And since we've just seen the third installment of Steven Pinkert's Triumph of the Enlightenment, I don't think he talked about climate change. Maybe that's for the next book. But do you want to elaborate on that in the context of the current project?
About Steve's book? Or
No, on the dialectic of the Enlightenment.
Well, you know, they were very prescient about this in one way, because particularly Horkheimer, who I have always thought was intellectually the more vigorous of the two of them, although the less recognized. And his notion was that the logic of rational logics are always embedded into bureaucracies, in which the bureaucracy kills the logic which founded it. It's a similar idea to Weber's notion of the routinization of charisma, that once you try and institutionalize something, the initial aim that it meant to serve was strangled by that. There is a kind of anti-science romanticism in Adorno, which is not there in Horkheimer. Adorno is, he's a figure straight out of the world of Alban Berg, or that whole era of feeling that Robert Musil, all of that. He's really formed by this notion of science as somehow a degradation of, the Gefühl of feeling and so on. And it sits, I don't want to give you a long lecture about this, it sits very uneasily with his notions about his critique of authenticity and so on. Put that aside. The Horkheimer thing, I think, is, what I'm hoping is that that's not true about the way state actors and non-state actors deal with climate science. That is, that the bureaucracies like ours, which are measuring, trying to make transparent greenwashing, or trying to codify the needs of needy countries, will kill off the impulse to do something. And that's a very serious issue. The other thing I'd say about this, you should never have asked me this question, is that the idea of knowing and not knowing, the Stan Cohen's formulation of this, that knowledge is disempowering if it's presented as something that has this kind of narrative shape where there's a denouement or there's a disaster. That I think there is something quite perverse about that, but also true. And it's something we need to take on board because we've got to end these knowledge campaigns. They're counterproductive for us. Most climate deniers know all about climate change. They've just transposed the rhetoric and the language of denial into something else, which is, live while you can, so on. Your children are not your responsibility. There's a whole, on the web, you'll find that over and over again. So we've taken on board this notion that this is a failed strategy, that simple knowledge will be mobilizing. And that's also part of deep adaptation, which is that the narratives in which something are known have to be the only ways to shape the ways in which people will act on what they know. It's not the facts, the data, and so on. It's a big issue for us. But in it, we could talk about this all night. Ask me a couple more questions, and then I'd like to eat dinner.
Hi, Richard. I was interested to hear you talk. I'm over here, Ianthi.
I don't see you.
Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Hi.
Hi.
I had advocated for the spotlight to turn away from you, but...
Now I see you.
So you had talked about climate refugees, and I was wondering if you think that this is a tool that could be used to sort of play on all these protectionist impulses of these countries where they're going to come into, and will that help create action, and what action can people actually take?
Well, about the climate refugee issue, in the way the UN is framed, being a refugee, there are no climate refugees. There are only climate migrants. And the reason for that is that the 1951 law on the Accord on Refugees is defined basically still that you have a well-founded fear of persecution if you were to return to your country of origin. So that, and anybody who doesn't have that well-founded fear, say, for instance, that you have a well-founded fear that you would starve to death if you return to your country of origin, we have very few protections for refugees, but as the law stands now, climate refugees don't fit into that pattern. So there is a working group. There's been, people have tried to reverse the refugee accords decade after decade to deal with other sorts of circumstances. And now this has made the revision of that accord more urgent. And we have a big working group on that, which I'm part of. I don't know where we'll get with that. It does provide, once you get UN refugee status, there are some minimal protections that you get, but we have very little money. So the actual help we can give people, well, we can protect people, for instance, from the current Home Secretary in Britain, who says that anybody who gets in a boat to try to get to Britain is a fake refugee. You know, I guess you only have to fly or take book passage on a ship or something like that. But there are protections. We can help refugees, boat people, if they get this legal representation. But at present, we're still dealing with a very inadequate set of accords about what is the difference between a refugee and a migrant. Your question maybe should be addressed to Saskia Sassen, who has written on this for decades, but it's a question that we're now facing quite urgently, because if you are, if your well is dried up and you're a refugee and it ultimately takes you to Turkey and Turkey takes you to Greece, et cetera, and Greece takes you into the continent, you need protection. You need to be helped, and what we can do is provide a kind of minimal framework so that someone doesn't say, take the little skiff that you've crossed the English Channel with because you don't have any rights. So this is another aspect of deep adaptation, I'm afraid. Can we take one more question, and then I'd love to have some wine, actually.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
No. I'll tell you one thing about just the atmosphere at COP26. It's in a building which is huge building, conference center, which is isolated from the rest of Glasgow, which is like Rome, is in the midst of garbage crisis. There's uncollected garbage everywhere. And when you walk out of the conference center to get a breath of fresh air, what you smell is accumulations of weeks of garbage. There are rats everywhere. And one of the kind of protections of the people inside the conference center is to make sure the rats don't cross over the green zone into the blue zone where all these people are. So it's a little island in a city which is really quite stressed out. There are 25,000 people who are attending this in one way or another. And today we had another 15,000 kids who had a climate action there. There's no place for them to sleep, so they're sleeping in the streets amidst all this garbage. So it's, I thought the other night, isn't this a perfect metaphor for the modern world? This urban condition. Most of the 25,000 are actually commuting from Edinburgh. What's that firm that rents out rooms? Airbnb. Evidently, its profits have shot up all over Scotland for this. So it's really quite an extraordinary scene of privilege and disprivilege, absolutely cheek by jowl. Amazing. So I'll answer one more question, then I'm going to have I've earned my glass of wine.
There will be another one.
No.
I have a question for you.
Where are you?
I'm Catherine. I'm Ned's assistant. I don't know if everybody knows this, but I'm a poet.
Oh.
And speaking of privilege and disprivilege, and my question is, if knowledge is not the way to mobilize people and narrative is, what do you think about the potential or capacity of art and the possibility of mobilizing people politically?
I believe in it totally.
Excellent.
Actually, I'm writing a book about this because I believe it absolutely that what it does is mobilize people's imagination and carry on, do it.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, thanks.